Welcome back to AM Agenda. As the election looms, the budget was handed down and the Treasurer didn't make many unpopular decisions. There were not many cuts. It was headlined by a cost of living package that put cash, millions of dollars, billions of dollars, I should say, into the pockets around 10 million Australians. Joining me live is the CEO of PwC Australia, Tom Seymour. Tom, thanks so much for your time. Every budget we look for a strategy, I think, from a Treasurer. How do you think this government has balanced the need for discipline but also winning an election?
Look, it is a fine balance, and you've seen lots has been said about the cost of living benefits in the budget and the handout, so to speak, and they are there, but it is fair to say that they are relatively targeted and they're transitional in large sense. So they are definitely there, and I think they were always going to be a feature of the budget. What though you need to consider, I think, is in the scheme of the entire budget, that they could afford to do that because taxation revenue's up, commodity prices are high, and they're ahead of plan. So I think lots going to be said about that. It's probably more of a pre-election rather than a post-pandemic budget in that regard. But there was also some spending, like the 10 billion on cyber is a much more structural, long-term reform. So there's a mix of it there. No major reform, though. I'm sure we'll talk about that more. The elephant in the room is we are going to be in debt until 2060. Unless someone steps up with major reform, and we're yet to see that from, frankly, either side of politics. 2060.
It's a long way away.
Yeah, it is a long way away. And when you think about that and you just sit back and you think, eventually there is a conversation that Australia's going to have about some really tough reform that's got to come. And that's going to be sobering reading when it comes because to get that debt paid off at a faster rate than what's currently planned or a business as usual approach, we are going to have to lean into major reforms. But they're not going to be easy political reforms, and certainly you're not going to see that in a pre-election budget. And I think, in fairness to all politicians at the moment, Australians are coming out of 2 years of pretty tough 2 years of COVID, bushfires, floods. Is Australia up for a really tough conversation about hard reforms where there will be serious trade-offs and sacrifices made? It's probably not the time, but it is going to have to come at some stage.
No, not right now. And I remarked on budget night that I think after the last couple of years we've had, life does feel pretty good right now. And Josh Frydenberg did remind people that it was JobKeeper and those payments that did keep Australia afloat. I think he was right to do that. So, Tom, you sound like you're relieved that there's not, more structural saddlebags in this budget. We've got the big cash splash, but it's not structural. You're talking about big reforms that is going to be needed. Hopefully the first term of a new government does that. What will you be looking for?
I think there has to be some sort of tax reform. Tax reform has been overdue in this country for decades, really. But as you sort of move further and further in to a post-pandemic world, particularly with inflation running and the prospect of interest rates going up and the cost of the debt becoming a bigger problem for Treasury, I think tax reform and a shift away from just taxing, wages and taxing profits to a much broader base of taxation is inevitable in this country. We're lagging the world on that. So tax reform's one. I also think there's a massive piece around regulatory reform that is going to have to come. And if you think about how do you grow an economy, how do you drive productivity, how do you decarbonise an economy, it's got to become easier to get major projects to the starting line. And we've added regulation consistently in the last 15 years in this country. And regulation plays a critical role and it's important. But we need to modernise regulation. We need to streamline it. We can't have regulation overlaps between state and federal, because if you want to get those major renewable projects up, those major critical minerals projects up, those major data projects up that are going to really take our economy up and grow our economy so that tax as a percentage of GDP repays the debt without just increasing tax, you're going to have some trade-offs and compromise. And I see compromise in tax reform. I see compromise around regulatory reform where people are going to have to give up the right to say no and time box that much more. So I think regulatory reform, tax reform are two big obvious ones.
Yeah.
And, that's not easy because both of them require a degree of federation, cooperation. And, we've all seen how hard that is in the current environment.
We have. And look, I think from the New South Wales Premier, used to be Treasurer, he was up for some of that tax reform. But are we talking about GST? Is that where you see this happening?
Look, I think GST is part of it, but frankly, the biggest asset category appreciating in value today, and has been for some time, is property. And, there's a lot of wealth being created in property that's not taxed. So the tax net, if you just focus the tax net on, income tax and corporate tax, you're really only taxing a section of society. So how do you broaden that base and tax wealth? And as inflation kicks in, and we believe inflation is structurally here to stay for the period in future, inflation will benefit capital holders, so that capital will become more valuable, inflate in value. So how do you sort of design a tax system for the times? And we already have a very high marginal rate. We have high average tax rates. Our corporate rate's pretty high on global standards. So it's going to have to go to things like GST and land tax, which is exactly what the New South Wales Premier, then Treasurer, was proposing. And I think that will gather momentum as the reality of that debt sets in and interest rates start to climb up.
Right, okay. You talked about one of the good structural changes in the budget, and that was that $9.9 billion invested in cyber security. Again, on budget night, this kind of didn't get a lot of attention, but once we get into the election campaign, I think this has a very retail aspect to it. I think small business noticed that, and even individuals, households did as well. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's the centrepiece of the budget, really, from a structural point of view. National security is increasing daily as a point of interest and concern for Australians and, frankly, everyone in the world. And cyber is both a defensive and an offensive play around that. But it's actually a huge opportunity to modernise skills in Australia. And if you think about it, of the 10 most valuable companies in the world today, 8 of them are data companies. And data is a currency of value, which is why cyber and cyber crime is massively increasing. So if we can position ourselves as a cyber sort of leader in skills, which I really think we can as a nation, linked to defence, that will actually trickle down to create new industries and high-tech, high-paid industries. And that's how you get wage inflation up. You actually shift your workforce up the value chain. So I think the cyber announcements are critical, both from a national defence and security perspective, but actually an economic prosperity and skills training perspective into the future. Not easy to execute on because we now need to train and build that workforce, but really putting a clear signal and money behind it over a 10-year period in Red Spice, as its code name is, does give you confidence and business confidence to invest behind government in it. So I think that's a really strategic and important announcement in the budget.
Yeah, they did a lot of work trying to make that acronym fit, I must say. But
yeah, I can imagine how many attempts they came up to make that work.
Exactly. Red Spice, you'll hear a lot more about it in this election campaign. Tom, a pleasure to talk to you this morning. Thanks so much. We'll do it again soon.
Good on you. Thanks, Sophia.